So, Alex Hornstein, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us. Where are you located right now?
I'm in Providence, Rhode Island.
In the USA.
Yes, in the
Cool.
US, sorry.
Cool. All right. So we have this climate data hackathon happening, and we want to ask you a few questions in a like short format. Is that okay with you?
Of course.
Okay. So, first question: what are the things you've enjoyed inventing the most, and why?
Mm, let's see. Gosh, there's a lot.
A
So,
few of them, yeah.
uh, one that is has been a very long-standing project in my life is a series of holographic display inventions called Looking Glass. Um, so this was a company I co-founded with a friend and was all about creating this vision of how holograms can look and work that was kind of like the thing we grew up dreaming of. Um, this was technically challenging, it was creatively challenging, and it was there's a whole world of um, different aspects that we got to invent and explore together, which I loved. Um, and a more recent one, which has been uh, equally interesting, has been a project I've started called Wild Lives, which is all about taking the tools that scientists use to understand wildlife behavior and dynamics in the wild and adapting those so that they can be used by grade school children in a way that feels genuine and authentic and interesting to understand wildlife behavior around them. And so some of that is designing new tools, some of that is adapting tools that are used by scientists and adapting those so they feel intuitive and can be used by very young children in a very similar way, but a way that feels age appropriate and compelling.
Thank you. So those two actually they are new technologies, but every time for those technologies to take off, they sort of have to naturally build a community of users, of contributors. So you've built a bunch of communities. So I don't know if it was intentional or accidental, but you ended up building those communities and very active engagement. This is a bit more technical, but what kind of tools, both like in terms of infrastructure, but like the technical tools, like what did you use to build those communities?
Um, Changes all the time. So it's really depends on the community and the goal. So um, some of the uh, in the case of Looking Glass, some of these are just very common off the shelf, open source, off the shelf tools like discourse forums, uh, more common tools like Discord and other ways to have real time chat and connectivity with users. Others of them within Looking Glass, we built a fairly large community called KubeTube, where we had built a product where people would make and share these open source apps for a 3D LED cube that we had designed and built and shipped. And there was a way that they could essentially make little Arduino-like sketches that they would share. They could simulate in real time, and you could kind of scroll through and see other people's sketches and click, and then it beams over Wi-Fi onto yours. So that was a combination of a lot of, there was someone's platform that enabled that. It was kind of the underlying tech behind it. And then there was a whole custom website that we built and deployed and got tens of thousands of people build of different apps on it, built by thousands of users. And it was that itself was a really fascinating kind of combination of developing technology to enable the community, and then that plugged into inventions we had created, and then pulling people into this world was really nice. Um, Within Wildlives, it's a much less technology driven. At least on the ground, you're working with young children, but on the other hand, a lot of what we build is still has a technological underpinning, which is uh, we work a lot with trail cameras and other tools for filming wildlife in situ. And these are kind of dumb commodity cameras that they'll just record a video. And as soon as you start doing this, even with a single class, you might have 4 to 6 cameras. And as soon as you have this and you work for, let's say, 6 weeks with the class, you're going to end up with 10 to 30,000 videos. And what do you do with that? There's too many videos. So we started building websites for cataloging and sharing and collecting all the metadata from those videos as well, which includes the time, the place, everything from the phase of the moon to the temperature of the air, and starting to turn that in addition to extra information we collect about how children map and understand the site. And we start to use that to sort and make this a quickly viewable site that our specific thing was a middle schooler with a crappy phone and a crappy data plan could use and enjoy and be able to see the results of them and their fellow students' work, understanding the environment right outside their school.
So these are like really huge database because you have both like many profiles of users, and each of them have like many projects, and those projects have many like files and stuff like this. So this is a technical question, but like what kind of database did you use? Was it like a combination of multiple database, or the reason why I'm asking is because we are trying to build like a really large climate data sets, and which is going to also be user generated. So if you think about that sort of architecture, what kind of database do you think we should be using?
Um, well, I can tell you what we used, and it may or may not. I think, depending on just the sheer amount of data that's flowing in and the number of sets and all these things change, as well as like the number of users that are accessing it. So we had a combination of, on one side, we had a large amount of static media files. So we have the largest database in the state of wildlife footage, which is kind of like winning the best effort prize at the school science fair. We live in the smallest state in America. It doesn't take much, but but the core data that we have coming through is hundreds of thousands now of videos of wild animals, and you quickly so it's I don't know where we're at. We're at probably coming up on we're easily in many hundreds of gigabytes, probably close up to like a terabyte, maybe a terabyte and a half of footage. And so we dump that into Amazon S3. That's just an easy way to just collect a ton of data. On the way, we bounce through a server that we run. Our database itself is a MySQL database. It's run through a Django Python web framework, which has a model for how we collect and kind of make all of these different data points relate to one another. So for example, we might have a site where we put a camera, and that camera might have individual videos. Each video might be tagged with an animal that appears in it. It has things like the time it was recorded. It has, these are the individual data points. And then those then have a GPS tag. So that fits into a larger location and understanding of an environment. And we're at a relatively small scale in terms of like the sheer number of users that are accessing our data, as well as we have a large amount of footage coming through, but it's a relatively small number of like individual users on our site at any one time. So our system works for that, the thing we designed it for, but depending on what you wanted to build, you might use a slightly different architecture or setup for it.
Did you build a CMS to sort of create like all these fields and the entry and retrieval? And did you build it from scratch, or did you use an existing CMS that is on SQL and Django and all that stuff?
I built it from scratch. So my
Was it a
like
wise decision?
I think so, actually. So,
Yeah.
so in the world of camera trap data and collection, there's a very robust ecosystem for dealing with photographs. This is the standard
Oh,
in all camera trap science, is you put up a camera that will trigger, and record photos every time, like maybe 1 or 3 photos every time an animal comes in. And the way like all camera trap data works, all camera trap science works, is you put out X number of cameras, like one every square kilometer, or one every half a square kilometer, or whatever that is. And they might have a cell connection, so they're auto beaming back footage, or you might have grad students going out and collecting SD cards. And you end up with, just like we have piles of this data. And then you want to, for a long time, you would have your undergrads go through and be like, that is a zebra, that is a lion, that is a wildebeest. But now you have, in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of AI, 10, 15 years, a lot of AI-driven recognition and tagging of individual species and even individual animals within a species, which is really neat. None of this works for video. But we, of course, were working with children. And any child will tell you, photos are so boring. Video, that's where it's at. Like, oh my God, swipe right. And so we had to build, we couldn't use existing pipelines for working with this because no one worked with this at the scale that we do, or even in the way that we wanted to. And then on top of that, we found ourselves working with many different levels of data. So for example, we have geospatial data of where was this taken, how did it move around? We have contextual data, and then we want to present that in an interesting way. So if you think about camera trap footage, there's 3 main variables, which are what's in the video, there's when the video was taken, there's where it was taken. And you want to be able to scrub and make an interface for each one of those. Potentially, I could have, if I was like a different person, used someone else's CMS and found a way to massage this in, but I kind of love just like starting with a blank terminal and just like, and so I built up this model and would, as we start working with kids, I would spend a bunch of time like working with preschoolers, and then I would come back until like I could enable the next thing that I wanted to do. And so there was a lot of this very rapid, like, we're going to test it. Kids themselves have zero interest in this thing that I'm doing technically, but this has to do with how it's opening up this pathway of how they can relate, how they see their work, how we present the work that they've done, how they understand what they're learning, and how they're like the understanding they're building of the natural world.
That's incredible. So in the discussion we had in the last hackathon, we were talking about doing data storage, climate data storage, because we know it's gonna like double every 2.5 years. Eventually, the S3 Amazon server would really like explode if we start to like aggregate a lot of climate data. And so we're talking about like torrents as a way to do long-term storage. So the idea is that we will have a layer of some of the most popular climate data sets to be available on AWS because it's just for convenience. But for a lot of the data, which is more exotic and less used, we're thinking of using a torrent. So it means that when people want to render a map, they might have to wait a few seconds for the data to sort of like being pulled out. But we think that this may be. Do you think it's a good direction to go with torrents? Because we want to be censorship resistant. Because as you know, in America, we just pulled out of the Paris Accord, and climate science is going to be is going to be defunded. So we need to make sure that we have a system that's scalable and is not too expensive. What do you think of this idea of torrent? Have you ever played with torrent before? Do you think it's a viable direction?
I personally would never use torrents for the streaming of any illegal media. I find such an act reprehensible, and I would never consider doing such a thing. However, um, I think the technology is great when it comes to having like a large decentralized way to move and store data. I really appreciate that. My note of caution, and this is someone who is not in the climate data world, and perhaps I have a different view of it. But like from where I stand in America, I don't see the government trying to censor data. I see the government just ignoring it. And so I would, like my sense as someone who believes that we have a scientific understanding and we have to bridge this big gap between this is something a small number of people get and understand what to do to now everyone knows what to do. Um, we're very far from that in America. Maybe everywhere in the world, but particularly in America. 2 days ago, we just got a lot farther. Um, but my initial concern would be like I wouldn't, from where I sit, I wouldn't sweat this architecting and putting in all of this effort for avoiding censorship if you don't have a way to also make that be relevant to people in this larger context of how does it get out into the world. Um, so um, that said, torrents are great. Like especially if you have people who can uh, sign up and who can run and who have high bandwidth like access and who can run some form of sophisticated software. That's a totally fine way to move around lots of data. Um, you have to have enough data. You either have to have a way to parcel and pull in like individual, the way like a torrent will break down a file into individual chunks. Um, uh, you know, I suppose I would have a question of how many people do you need in your, like as seeders for this to be well seeded and useful? And since you ask about censorship, um, I would ask about the choke points. Like, for example, if this is like, I don't know, hundreds of terabytes, like petabytes of data, um, uh, where does that, does any one person have that, like in one spot? Um, is that do people only have different chunks? And like the other thing with torrents is like, if I want to go and find, which I never would, a very rare song or an esoteric band that very few people listen to and it's fallen out of style, it's hard to find that because there's very few. I have to go like, um, a common search engine. It reflects what's fashionable. And so that's the hazard of torrents is that no one likes to hold the unfashionable data.
Thank you. Um, so when you're creating, for example, like CubeTube, or when you're creating the wildlife, you're creating so much value for people. And there's only a few places where it feels right to also ask for money. Like for example, CubeTube, they're already buying the device, right? So they're already investing some money into buying hardware. But then it takes so much resources to maintain the software and to build this online platform. So in terms of climate data, because you also deal with a lot of environmental data, maybe like the trap camera data, where do you think it is fair to collect some money from the people who are participating? So imagine we have this big data set. There's a lot of like thousands of people who are like uploading climate data. Like, where do you think it's fair to take money, and where do you think there should be more money coming in? Who should be more paid for doing this work?
So this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but I kind of like the way this is structured, and it feels somewhat similar to um, uh, the some of the ways you've mapped out or you've presented as a way to collect climate data. So thinking about FlightAware, um, which is the flight tracking system, there is a shockingly small number of people who bought the hardware that is tracking this worldwide. It's called ADS-B data, is the signal that airplanes beam out over their radio. And the thing that makes FlightAware work are these $30 dongles called the RTL SDR, like the software-defined radio thing. You plug it in, it costs $30, and it can tune in automatically to this data that's coming in from airplanes, and it can record it and put it into the system. These are like the super users. It's like somebody who has who decided they wanted to get a radiation monitor and contribute data to your system. But nobody does that if they don't care about flight data. Like you do this because you're interested. And so what they get is free access to the data. You contribute to the data, you get free access. That's the FlightAware deal. Um, and you know, maybe you paid $30 for this thing and you go through the effort of like making sure it works and so on. Um, but uh, it's not this is like hundreds of people, not like tens of thousands or millions of people that are in this role. Um, I can use it to track an individual flight. So if like my parents are flying from my home back to their home because they came to visit, I can track that. But if I want to find the history of the flight, that's a paid subscription. If I want to go back in data, if I want to follow what happened to a particular airframe as it moved and what its history was, then that is a very specific, that's paid data. That you'll see it right there as FlightAware Premium. Um, there's always someone who values that, and so that's their model. Is that the case in climate? Like everyone wants to track a flight at some point in their life. Everyone's going to have a loved one on a plane, and this is like a kind of a normal thing to want to like follow where they go. Of course, everyone also has a loved one in the climate, but is there, do you need to pay a monthly subscription to follow that or understand it or anything else? Mm, I'm not sure. Like it might be that there's a few. It's really a question of how many climate users there are um, who want to get access to these big data sets. But I love this system of like, if you contribute here, like you can get it. Here's what it takes to contribute. This is useful. This is a good thing to do if you support climate science. Um, and for academic researchers, easy, go get a university grant. Like buy this like thing that contributes like this data stream into a large data set. Um, uh, for individuals, not crazy expensive. There's piles of ways to contribute meaningful data with very inexpensive devices. And then specialist stuff becomes more specialized, more complex. It doesn't necessarily mean it's more expensive. It's just the thing you have to go look for. Um, but yeah, I would really ask that question of like um, how broad the number of people who would pay for this or who use climate data. And that can be obviously like what's about to happen in the US, like talking about like defunding NOAA, uh, which is wild. Now, I don't think that will happen because a lot of our predictions for, uh, for example, uh, how the weather works, like relies on National Weather Service and NOAA, like releasing climate balloons constantly and running like thousands and thousands of buoys out in the like in the ocean, and all these things that we see and appreciate that we think of as private companies like Windy or the Weather Channel. Um, these don't operate the data gathering services. They get them for free from the government. Um, and if the government stopped doing this, these for-profit businesses would collapse. They actually lobby um, for like the National Weather Service in the U.S. to not be able to advertise its data. So I can go to the National Weather Service government website, but they're forbidden by law to create an app that makes it easy to do so. They actually are crippled by law, and that's a direct result of lobbying of what they can do with their own data by for-profit entities like the Weather Channel. Um,
My my perception is that there could be a tendency with the new leadership in the US to want to privatize a lot of the data that is not public. Well, I don't know if it's happened, but because Elon Musk, SpaceX, basically taking a lot of the NASA contract, I could imagine like a lot of NOAA stuff being taken over or like acquired capacity by weather.com or I could see like a privatization generally, like because it's the billionaire class right ruling the country. So
Yeah, I mean, like that, honestly, if I think of a dystopian future, it's less one that is censored, it's more one that is owned by private individuals. And, that, um, and more one where the machinery of government is just directly steered into their hands. So that I don't even think, you know, well, I love to shit on SpaceX as much as the next guy. Like they took over those contracts from their own conglomerate of large government groups like ULA. It's not a new thing. They just did it cheaper. Um, so I think this is a trend that's been ongoing for some time. but it's accelerating now, and that is,
Mhm.
so it's where I think having um, like objectivity in general and trust in institutions is very hard. It's very hard to find an institution, or increasingly hard, that you trust to be objective. And
Mhm.
I generally do trust large groups of people acting independently to
Mhm.
uh, be a good source for individual observations, especially if you can collect that. And of course, there's going to be error. Of course, there's going to be issues, but I find that, especially if you find, say, some NOAA predictions that are getting marked up by Sharpie, and then having people insist that that is the objective truth when it clearly is not. Sometimes you want something to back that up if you're losing objectivity in your actual data.
So my last question is this. So if we need objectivity in the data to have a future on which we have a foundation to like discussion and being able to live in the same world basically. Do you have an image of what a sort of perfect world looks like in terms of like environmental data? Because you do a lot of environmental data measurement as well. Like, is the goal to digitalize everything and then we really understand like reality through bits rather than through atoms? Like, what is in your mind like a perfect state of environmental data being available or controlled by a particular group of people? What do you think what is a perfect scenario?
It's a good question. Mm, I have two answers to that, unfortunately. One is a local answer, and one is a global answer. So, at a local level, um, one of the ways that I learned to observe nature around me in a way that felt richer and more connected and observant to it is a practice that is a lifelong practice of paying attention to what's around you. It's something that I teach my students. It's something that I think is critically important. That um, uh, like I'm right in the middle of a post-industrial city, and it looks like there's nothing but shattered glass and brick. Um, and I can walk one block and I can point out where a family of 5 otter live in the middle of this. And no one else in my neighborhood knows that they're there. And no one knows that they're there because they run in the drainage pipes and they are there among us. And you only find that by looking closely. Um, that's fascinating. And it's the sort of thing that, no amount of large data is going to bring that up. The only way you can have an insight like that is with personal observation and having a personal relationship with the environment around you. Um, at a large level, um, I would put it like this: is everything we as humans have developed, like a lot of our existence, is about being able to predict that the world is going to work in a regular, predictable way. The foundations of agriculture, of the way we build our houses, the way we build our cities, all of this is where we put our cities. All this is based around those predictions. And we made those predictions on a different planet than the one we live on right now. Um, and this throws a lot of uncertainty into the world. And anyone who tells you that it's solved is blowing smoke up your ass. There is more uncertainty in what things are going to look like in the near future and far future now than there may have ever been, shy of like Cold War era, like on the brink of nuclear war. Um, and so, having not just data that shows the current state of the world, but by having evolving and tested and peer-reviewed models of what will happen as we're trying to understand this world. Um, I love that as an idea. And I love having like a very rich data set as a test bed for that because like when I look at my 10-year-old daughter and one of the questions in my mind is like, should we move to a further north forest? Is that like what could I do? What actions could I do that ensure her and her eventual children's livelihood and survivability in a increasingly distraught world. Does that mean should we move to the global south? Should we move to like further north latitudes that are less susceptible to climate change? Are there particular places that make sense as we're trying blindfolded to put a pin in this map of uncertainty on the planet? And I think of that as a personal choice, but of course, this is a policy choice. This is a choice that affects governments, it affects businesses, it affects every single person, unfortunately, in the climate. And whether we try to or not, you cannot live outside of the climate. So I find that anything that we can do that makes that accessible and trusted and in a rapid fire iteration as we try to map onto this changing, we try to map our new models onto this changing data, and we try to ask questions of those models and interpret what those models predict and the uncertainty that's in them. I like the idea of that being in the public eye and that being a trusted public source, where currently there are not many. They're either that connect to the public or that have that are in a position of trust or a position of objectivity.
With public input. Yeah.
With public input. Yeah.
Yeah. My very last question is this one is that I was working on mapping coral reef for a couple of years, and I was when I was reading the literature and those projections that you talk about, I was so afraid that I was going to spend the rest of my career, making high resolution pictures of a species that is basically going to go extinct. We almost know for certain, and I couldn't sleep anymore just thinking about that. And so I'm wondering, like, you also like have those camera traps and you're producing this huge amount of data, and you're like excited and um, like what keeps you hopeful, or what gets you excited about doing this kind of work of doing like work related to like environmental climate data?
So I'll tell you a couple of good examples that I love, that actually I find very hopeful. Um, so um, I'm in the middle of this big city, Providence, big city. But we've chopped down all the stuff and we built all the big buildings, and there's very little open land in this place. And one of the main rivers that runs through here is the Mahashuk River, which means where the moose come to drink. And moose, for those of you who aren't familiar, are a ridiculously huge animal, like well over 1,000 pounds, huge ungulate. It's awesome. And
Yeah.
they used to be, within the last 100 years, they used to be in the middle of my town. Like, that's crazy. Um, uh, so a couple years ago, we had some middle schoolers who had a tributary of the Mahashuk running right behind their middle school. And they went and set up camera traps. And this school is not a nature preserve. This school is full, like the playground is full of trash and hypodermic needles, and this is a inner city school, and it is not a pleasant one. However, in this little creek right behind their school, um, there's beaver, there's otter, there's muskrat, there's wood duck, and some of the fascinating things about this are wood duck 100 years ago were hunted to the very brink of extinction. And by large-scale human filling in of wetlands and destruction of habitat, we almost knocked these off the map. Um, Migratory Bird Act is the piece of policy that is responsible for their continued existence. And now my students can see them. We have, as a species, or at least, well, in our case, in America, decided as a society that we shouldn't wantonly destroy it. Beaver, we wantonly destroyed. Trappers killed all the beaver in the entire state. They were extirpated. Almost killed all the white-tailed deer, which to anyone living in the state now, they're dull as dishwater. You see them everywhere. You can't shake a stick without hitting a deer. Don't hit a deer. We hunted them wantonly and to abandon. And if you were to say 40 years ago, hey, there's beaver in Providence, everyone would tell you that was a stupid thing because there hadn't been beaver in Providence for about 100 years. Now they're back. My middle schoolers find them. They came in from Canada. There's ecosystems around me that are not just chugging along, but that are at pre-human intervention levels, like the great white sharks and gray seals off of Cape Cod, a mile from, or an hour and a half's drive from me. Um, these have recovered through the Endangered Species Act, through the Marine Mammal Protection Act. There have been things we have done at country scale and even beyond country scale that have had large protective impacts that I see every day and my students see every time I take them out to go look at it. So I that's not to minimize it. Like these are laws. These are put in by people who have to decide they should be there. One of the reasons I work with children is that children like animals and children can understand if you can see this thing that you normally never see, that this is worth keeping around. Um, and so, I understand that part of maintaining protection and legal status is about having public engagement and being able to be like, this is cool. I'm really glad we have these animals around. I'm really glad they still exist. I am richer and better off for having an understanding and cohabitating and sharing their space and sharing my space with them. Without me doing anything. This is here. It's here because of a previous generation of conservationists succeeding. And gives me hope that this generation can also succeed.